Hello and welcome to Buildings of Tomorrow. My name is John Lester, and in today's episode, we are talking about wireless technology for a facility manager or an owner of a building. When are the right times to use it, and what's the decision? What are some of the things that have to be considered when we're deciding against traditional wired technology and wireless? I'm really lucky today to be joined by Michele Remonato. He is the head of IoT devices at Siemens Smart Infrastructure for product management. Michele, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, John. Great to be back.
Amazing. Yeah. And thanks so much for joining us again. I'm excited. So we've had a previous conversation. We talked about different technologies, some of the areas where these technologies have advantages, technically, some different applications. Today, we wanted to talk about making that decision. We have this technology available to us. If I'm a facility manager, an owner, an operator of a building, what are some of the situations, what are some of the pieces of information I need to make that decision, whether I go in a traditional route and use wired technology, or I go in the wireless direction? So to start off with, give us a little bit of an introduction. What are some of the things that we need to think about? What are some of the topics that need to be considered? And give us a little bit of a highlight about some of those introductions about where wired and wireless sit within this scope.
Absolutely. There are many facility managers and building operations companies that are already looking into wireless. There are also many that are moving their first steps today. So the first step is really to understand that there is no one fit-all technology when we talk about wireless. And the first question that we often get asked is, where does it make sense to actually use wireless? So there are a lot of variables at play. Energy efficiency, installation cost, range, latency. So it can be a bit overwhelming, especially for a facility management company that is just getting started with wireless, to figure out when it does make sense. So let's start with, first of all, some major indications. So for new buildings, that's a space where often wireless is in very tight competition with wired technologies. Wired technologies tend to be cheaper on a hardware level because they have less complexity and they have better economies of scale as of today. And also there are more trained installers and companies that can do the installation fast. So for new build, it is very often the case where wireless tend to be less interesting. And I like to start from where it is less interesting, because often we start from trying to selling it. Actually, I like to start from where does it make less sense as of today. So in general terms, new build tend to be less interesting, right? Nevertheless, there are huge opportunities because most of the buildings today are already there. So yeah, that's maybe a first step where to start.
Understand. So in general, in those new buildings, wired technology is what we know. It's what the industry has been doing for years. This is where we tend to find as you mentioned, the economies of scale, the different skill sets, some of the complexity makes wireless not the preferred solution. In these new builds, are there any situations or any applications where we see this balance shift a little bit, where we see wired kind of bring, with its flexibility and these kinds of things, bring an additional value which outweighs the kind of traditional economies of scale?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And that's also where I really like the idea of technology with purpose. So there is a use case, which is, I think, becoming really popular, where wireless makes a lot of sense also for new build. And that's the case when you have a frequent relay out. So let's imagine that you are a building owner and you invest in a commercial building where you maybe have 2 years contracts and you want to relay out either offices or even shops. And so you have a commercial building with multi-purpose and you have an interest to relay out frequently and you want to do that at scale, you want to do that efficiently, then wireless is definitely an extremely interesting solution. It reduces the complexity of wiring, right? So you can just move the devices around, and it reduces the amount of cable, right, that is in the building. It also allows you to basically reach any corner of the building. And I think it fits very well also with the design companies, the architecture companies, the engineers, depending on who is managing the plans, the floor plans, to get creative. So I think is a perfect example where wireless could also make sense for a new build. And finally, for the building owner, but also for the facility manager, there is a higher value per square meter of the building. There is less cost in doing the relayout. There is less cost in maintenance. And I think it's a very interesting space. And we are seeing it more and more, not only in Europe, but actually across the world.
Yeah, right. So in those situations where the initial hardware cost, is not something that you can invest in and you're leaving this for 10, 20, 50 years, you expect things to change, you expect people and the function of the spaces to change regularly. Wireless sort of brings in that additional ability to support that use case, to support that functionality with its own flexibility backed up in the technology. That links really nicely and really closely to the kind of standard conversation, or let's say the use case that we talk the most about with wireless, which is around retrofits, where you have something existing, and like you mentioned before, for every building we build, there's 100 buildings that already exist that also need new technology deployed into them. What are some of the key situations, challenges, but also benefits that we can address with a retrofit leveraging this wireless technology?
Yeah, I think retrofit basically, in very practical terms, means touching or changing something in an existing building that has already been designed, that has already been constructed, and where pretty much everything is already configured. So it's not so simple to bring in new devices, for example, sensors, for example, actuators. It could be a quite demanding task, and it could also be quite invasive for the building. So why would a company be interested in retrofit? Well, there are different reasons. First of all, technology may be outdated, so there may be new possibility to sense, for example, indoor air quality, or to collect data from meters, or to do new use cases that were not possible in the past. And there may also be regulation-driven use cases. So we saw that, for example, for indoor air quality during the COVID time, there was a wake-up call. Actually, there were many experts across the world demanding more transparency for tenants and for the people living inside a building to have better transparency on indoor air quality data. That was not really enforced by law, and now we see it. We see it in the US, we see it in China, we see it in Europe. So we can either use technology to do new things. We can use technology, wireless technology, to comply with regulation, finally also adding value for the tenants. So there is a quite interesting space there. And finally, wireless devices are really easy to use. You can bring them in the building. You don't need to have any invasive measure, break walls, or damage the property. And you can reach any corner of the building. And so I think they are extremely practical, and they also are becoming more and more popular. So there are more people that are understanding also the value that they generate.
Yeah, and I think that's a big shift that we've seen in the market. More people are using this, more people are developing the skills. I think that the trust and the understanding of the technology is growing every day, and it's kind of maybe the next step. I'd like to dig that conversation in, but before to understand then, because wireless is not just wireless. There's many things behind it. There's many different versions of technologies that are best for different applications. But before we get there, if I was a facility manager, a building owner, an operator who was trying to make this decision, because you mentioned earlier, and in the use cases you just described, there are many different situations that could help make this decision for us. How would it influence the decision between going in a wireless technology to a wide technology approach?
Yeah, so as you correctly described, there are a lot of variables at play. And wireless is, of course, a technology, so it's very easy to get into a very deep and detailed technology discussion from the get-go. The first recommendation is really to start from what is the business objective, or what is the value that we want to create, or finally the problem that we want to solve. Is it for retrofit? Is it for relayout? So I think it should start from a business goal, from a value creation goal, and then we can work backwards towards the technology. And some of the key variables that we need to answer is, for example, what is the range that we need to cover? Range is the first most demanding variable around wireless. And the next one is, what do we actually want to do? Do we want to monitor? Do we want to actuate something, so automate things? How much data is generated? And then how does this data relate between the different devices? Is there a central gateway, or do we have an expectation that this network is extremely reliable? So as you can see, there are a lot of variables at play. And then very often we get asked, why isn't there one single solution? Well, there isn't a one-fit-all technology. We need to pick the technology starting again from the business goal. And so navigating these technologies can be overwhelming, but I think there are a lot of expertise. There are a lot of experts in Siemens. We do have a lot of experts on this, and we can help our customers, our partners to navigate the complexity of the technology and, of course, consult them to make the best choice.
No, it's a really good point that I'd love to highlight, because as you say, IoT, wireless, some of the different technologies behind this, like Bluetooth and all the rest of it, it's so easy for us to dive into the technology, into the solution. We might forget about what we're trying to achieve. And maybe here is somewhere a challenge that wireless has had in the past, where people have thought, it's difficult to have a retrofit, or it's difficult for me to get a wire somewhere. I'll buy this wireless thing without thinking about what's required, what are some of the limitations, like the range that you mentioned, what are some of the goals that I'm trying to achieve before I then actually go and pick the solution itself. You mentioned there a few things about range, about application, whether we're monitoring, whether we're trying to automate and really actuate and drive a building, etc. My thought is that our next episode should be a little bit about this, because here we do dive into the technical, and we want to talk about every single, or some of the big protocols and some of the big technologies that we're talking about here. So maybe that's our next discussion. But to close this one, you mentioned that these different variables, these different considerations. If the building manager needs to know those end goals, if the building manager needs to start to think about that, where should they start? Is it just functionality, or should they look at the breadth or the time that they're going to be using this technology? What are your kind of final words for a facility manager or building owner making this decision that they can take into that thought process and that consideration before making this decision?
Yeah, it's a very challenging question. So let's try to break it down. I think there are three main points to look at. So the first one, what are the most pressing problems where IoT can help, right? So one of the key reasons why many IoT projects have failed in the past is because of a lack of focus. So I think identifying what are the problems that is the key step, right? And sometimes IoT may not be the answer. I believe very often it will be, but it may not be all the time. So, for example, for relayout, I think it's a very strong story. Or again, for a retrofit is also a very strong story. But let's start from the problem. That's the first one. The second is looking at what is the budget. What is the investment time horizon that the building owner has in mind? And I think when we look at increasing value per square meter, making the building more flexible, then wireless adds definitely a lot of value, right? And the third one is looking at the total cost of ownership. So wireless is not just a piece of hardware that is installed in a building. It requires certain competencies for installation. It requires certain competencies for managing over time, right? But it provides you some value back, as we discussed earlier. So to summarize, I would definitely focus on the problems of what are the key challenging pain points that the customer have, right? And bringing that to the table. I would try to understand better what are the budgets, the willingness to invest, and eventually also to get value per square meter for the building. And the third one is really looking at the total cost of ownership and that whether that could fit, right? A second reason why many IoT projects fail is also because the investment versus the cost is they're sort of not fitting between each other. And so that would be my recommendation to ensure that there is a good return on investment that creates value and it is sustainable over time. Right? That's how I would suggest it. But of course, it's a complex problem, and you always need help navigating it.
Yeah, for sure. Especially in a space like this where things move so quickly. Like everything, when we talk about IoT, things that are driven with these new technologies, we're able to leverage so much that happens around us, not just within the industry, but it also means that we're fast and things change on a daily basis. So that support, that partnership, that conversation, that expertise is such an important part of the decision. Michele, thanks so much for today. A really great conversation, and really interesting. So thanks so much for joining us. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you. It was also a pleasure for me, and looking forward to the next one.
Yeah, and the next one, I think, like we discussed, let's dive into some of those technologies. So for those out there who then want to hear a little bit about, what are some of these wireless protocols, what are some of these wireless technologies, where are they useful, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, and what applications do they fit the best with? That's going to be the next conversation together with Michele. So keep your eyes open. But until then, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for sitting with us for this conversation. Please remember to like, share, comment, subscribe wherever you're listening or watching this conversation, and always keep your eye out in every 2 weeks or so for the next conversation around buildings of tomorrow. So thank you, and we'll see you soon.
See you soon.